In our last episode, we dealt with a very difficult passage of 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 1 to 23. And we ended up with more questions than answers. You may want to go back to that video and rewatch it. To get some answers to the questions we raised, we turn now to some well-regarded Bible commentators to check what insights God may have given them. Hi, I'm Ken Gedevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thank you for joining us today. Here's some background to this passage of 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 1 to 23. Why is Ahab saying that Ramoth in Gilead, or Ramoth Gilead, belongs to Israel? David Gussig helps us out here. Previously, the king of Syria promised to return certain cities to Israel. Check it out, 1 Kings chapter 20, verse 34, in exchange for leniency after being defeated in battle. Apparently, this was one of those cities that Ben-Hadad never returned to Israel, and it was in a strategically important location. And what was the deal between Ahab and God's prophet Micaiah, M-I-C-A-I-A-H? Well, Ahab hated the messenger because of the message. His real conflict was with God, but he focused his hatred against the prophet Micaiah. And that's the way it is with many in the world today who hate us as believers. They do so because of our message about God. They know he exists, but they refuse to accept it. Otherwise, why bother with us if what we're attesting to is just plain nonsense? And what about all these other prophets involved? Gussig again, quote, "These unfaithful prophets, such as Zedekiah, prophesied in the name of the Lord, but they did not prophesy truthfully." Many commentators believe these prophets were pagan prophets, perhaps representatives of Asherah or other pagan gods or goddesses. Yet they clearly prophesied in the name of the Lord. It's best to regard these not as pagan prophets, but unfaithful prophets to the true God. End of quote. And once again, we're reminded of many of the prophets today, or many televangelists, if you like, today, that are preaching so much in the name of the Lord, but not preaching what the Lord would have them say. Now let's take a look a little closer at Micaiah. Micaiah was likely brought out from prison, as 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 26 to 27, which we'll come to later, alludes to that possibility. Now we see a prophet in rags and possibly in chains stand before two kings, ready to speak on behalf of the Lord. Commentator Trapp writes, quote, "This might have daunted the good prophet, but that he had lately seen the Lord sitting upon his throne with all the host of heaven standing by him. And hence he so boldly, in the face of these two kings, he could look so boldly at them while they were there in their majesty. For he beheld them as so many mice." Sometimes we need to think of our enemies as mice before God. Now Micaiah tells Ahab the same thing as the others. But King Ahab recognized the mocking tone of Micaiah's prophecy, and he knew it contradicted the message of the 400 prophets. He demanded that Micaiah tell him nothing but the truth, which Ahab believed and hoped would be the same message as that of the 400 other prophets. So Micaiah now gets serious. Sadly, things were not going to turn out well for Ahab. He had asked for the truth, but he couldn't handle the truth. Many of us are like that when it comes to various news we receive. I'm waiting for some news on my health. I believe I can handle the truth. I believe I will handle the truth. But there's always that wonder, will I be able to handle the truth? But the truth is the truth, and we have to deal with it. King Ahab and others at the court found it hard to explain how one prophet could be right and 400 prophets could be wrong. Either this was a true prophet of God or he wasn't. And if he was, one would have to believe that he saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing by, as our text says. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we'll see that when his prophecy was put to the test. He was bang on. And so it is with God and his word. Things now get very interesting. Micaiah talks about a host in heaven on both God's right hand and on his left. God's right hand is a place of favor, as we know. So this may indicate that God spoke to the combined host of heaven, both faithful and fallen angelic beings. Some people, myself included, forget that Satan and his fellow fallen angels have access to heaven. Check that out in Job chapter 1, verse 6, or Revelation 12, verse 10. There's a well-intentioned but mistaken teaching that God can allow no evil in his presence, meaning that Satan and other fallen angels could not be in his presence. These passages that I've just quoted show that God can allow evil in his presence, though he can have no fellowship with evil. And one day, all evil will be removed from his presence. Revelation chapter 20, verses 14 to 15. So God now asks for a volunteer from this host to go and persuade Ahab to go to battle, to die there, so that the righteous judgment of God would befall him. See, there's no avoiding this righteous judgment of God. Was this, was this a fallen or an unfallen angel? The text does not say outrightly, but some believe it was a fallen one. Apparently, one of the fallen angels volunteered for this task. Since Ahab wanted to be deceived, God would give him what he wanted, using a willing fallen angel who worked through willing unfaithful prophets. Chuck Smith adds this idea in explaining God's use of a fallen angel. He says, quote, Satan is a servant of God. He is serving God's purposes. That is why God has allowed him to exist. That's why God has allowed him freedom. He's acting in the sphere of his own free will. Yes, but yet the controls are ultimately held by God. We have made a tragic mistake in our thinking processes as we think of Satan as an opposite of God. End of quote. And I add, there's no comparison whatsoever in terms of power and authority. Here's Smith again, quote, God is an internal, omnipotent, self-existent being, whereas Satan is a created being and is in the rank of angels. So if you're looking for an opposite of Satan, you'd have to look at maybe Michael, one of the archangels. There you would have opposites. But in no way is Satan an opposite of God. No way does he rank even near God. He's existing under the total sphere of God, and though he is opposed to God, he is not an opposite of God in any sense of being an opposite to God, who is God, the eternal, omnipotent God. End of quote. Smith continues, Satan is definitely limited in his understanding, in his abilities, in his powers. They are limited by God. God says you can go so far, no further. Satan complained to God about the fact of his limitations in the case of Job. There's a verse that says, you put a hedge around that guy. I can't get to him. Just let me get to him. And he was complaining that God had put limitations on what he could do. So Satan is only allowed liberty within a limited scope. God puts the limitations on him, but he does serve purposes of God. Thus, God can use, and often does use, Satan or his emissaries to fulfill God's purposes. Here's the case where God uses a lying spirit to fulfill his purpose. End of quote. Hey, this is great news for the believer who lives in a world where evil is everywhere. We can know it goes only as far as God, perhaps reluctantly, allows. Thanks for watching. Next time we'll see how Micaiah is treated. Join us for that. And in the meantime, if you like what you see or hear, please indicate so on the video you're watching. And also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems, if you haven't done so already. A good number of you have. Thank you for that. But above all, I encourage you to keep on studying God's Word.